Start to learn about this faith, because this faith is your heritage. This faith is your inheritance. The mantle of your forefathers was to hand down to you this noble truth. When the liberal experiment of liberal progressive thought has collapsed in on itself and destroyed Western civilization, the church will still be here. We have outlived the caliphates. They've come and gone. Muhammad's experiment failed. The church is still here. What we need to do as an English community is to look at ourselves and say, why were those children so vulnerable to begin with? Where were their fathers? Shame on all their fathers that had these children and then abandoned them to be raped. Hitler once boasted. He said, what you think doesn't matter because we have your children. And he was applauded for it. But he was speaking the truth, because he understood that now that the Nazis controlled the state education, that within a generation or two, anyone who was opposed to the Nazis were irrelevant. At those things that are most fundamentally important for us to order our lives and our society correctly. And right now the liberal establishment wants you to focus on your benefits, your money, your bread, and the circus, the entertainment, the Friday night. Because while ever you're distracted by these two things and trying to preserve them, the Friday night entertainment and the bit of income that you get, they are free to do what they want, whatever they want. So brother, free your mind. Free your mind from atheistic material. Have you got a Bible?
No, I haven't. I'll be honest with you. I've never been endured towards it.
Okay.
Because as I said, I was brought up in quite an atheist family.
Yeah.
And still I have lots of answers, questions and answers I need to ask myself before. I find I've no problem with people practicing their religion. It gives them morals and it gives them guidelines and makes them live a healthy life. I have no problem with that at all.
Yeah.
That I think is I understand that. But I just can't sort of get my head around the big man thing yet.
Yeah.
It's something, although, there's been times I've gone, oh God, or Jesus.
These are cultural things, cultural echoes, aren't they? Yeah.
But I understand what you say about the left liberal media, and the mass mind control.
And lying about the church and lying about the Christian faith.
I haven't sort of heard that much about, but what I do see and I do understand is, like I said, about advertising, subliminal messaging, and then trying to control people. As you said, we've got a classic case of this going on here. A man was arrested, put in prison, basically doing
not much at all.
Nothing. Just. I'd understand if he was there up in arms and screaming and shouting. Fair enough, that's a breach of the peace, but I just think that it's coming to a point now where people have just had enough.
Yeah. Well, I would suggest to you, brother, that you get yourself a Bible app. You can download it for free on a smartphone. So you don't need to spend lots of money. It's really simple. You just download it onto your phone. Yeah? And a basic Bible plan, a basic Bible reading is read a psalm, because these are prayers, and say them like prayers. And then read a chapter of one of the Gospels, and then another time read a psalm and read a chapter of one of the letters of the apostles. That's a basic reading plan. Start to learn about this faith, because this faith is your heritage. This faith is your inheritance. The mantle of your forefathers was to hand down to you this noble truth. And we have had it stolen from us by a group of establishment figures who, because they wanted to be free to live their immoral lives, sought to strip us of any knowledge of our history as a people or any knowledge of our own culture. So if I asked you what is Whit Sunday about, would you be able to tell me? Don't worry, don't be embarrassed. Would you be able to say?
I would probably, in about an hour, it would tweak.
Yeah.
But because, you know...
There was a time when this knowledge of our own culture used to trip off the tongue. But we have undergone a cultural amnesia in the UK because our own culture has been taken from us. And we only have the loosest connections to our once noble past.
Because that society has gone on and we've come through the decades. It's like Christianity is sort of, there's been a vacuum where the churches around the whole of England, there's not much attendance as there was, say, in the 40s and 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Attendances are dropping.
I am not encouraging you to join the established, weak, effeminate Church of England with its cassocks and its kowtowing to the liberal establishment. The Archbishop is a prisoner of the establishment. What I'm calling you to embrace is the faith of your ancestors. To see what Christianity looked like properly, we have to look actually back centuries. We have to look back beyond the Enlightenment and around the Enlightenment time to see that the Christian faith was the civilizing force in Europe. And we have to take those truths whilst accepting that we no longer live in a Christian world, and we have to reinterpret them for our day to day. A muscular faith that can stand up for itself against all of the enemies of the church. And that includes the liberal establishment, the liberal media, and all of those groups that oppose the church, that seek to sideline the church, that seek to make the church humbled and humiliated so that it doesn't speak its truth.
Because obviously it goes against their interests.
It does go against their interests. But they have got us all by the balls, basically, because they've got us to buy into their hedonistic culture so much that many of us are frightened to allow the Christian faith to transform us. If you allow the love of God to enter your heart, it will transform you. It will transform your relationships. It will transform your life.
It's a very, very positive message, and I understand it. I have many of my friends, their parents are Christian. They say they believe in God, but they don't actually practice Christianity. They just say, yeah, I believe in God, and it's like, as you usually ask me that question, you could ask which day, and I'll probably remember in an hour.
Yeah.
So there are many people out there that actually say they believe in God, but they don't actually practice.
Yes. I mean, the truth be told, I come from a white working class family. So I feel that I can, if I want, barrage and disparage the white working classes, because that is my community. Yeah, I'm not attacking another community, I'm criticising my own. Now, the white working classes, when they get their census form, will tick the Christian box.
Of course.
And then if you ask them, what values do you live by? They'll say, oh, I live by, if you press them on religious topics, they'll say things like, well, I follow Christian values. But the reality is, they don't know them. They don't know them at all. So they're claiming this moniker of Christian and of a Christian heritage without any understanding of what that means. Because if I said to you that to be a Christian meant that you stopped being English, or to be a Christian meant that you joined a community of faith that conquered the Roman Empire, that defeated our ancestors, the Jutes, the Angles and the Saxons that invaded the Roman Empire, that defeated the Nordic pagan Vikings, that stood against three attempts by the Islamic Caliphate to conquer Europe and defeated them all. That stood against the Nazis, that stood against the communists and outlived them. I tell you the truth, when the United Kingdom is a footnote in history, the church will still be here. When the liberal experiment of liberal progressive thought has collapsed in on itself and destroyed Western civilization, the church will still be here. We have outlived the caliphates. They've come and gone. Muhammad's experiment failed. The church is still here. When you become a Christian, and I invite you to do so, I invite you to get your Bible app, download it, start reading it, right? And embrace that Christian faith that is your heritage as an Englishman. You know, Alfred, do you know who Alfred the Great is?
Yes.
Who is he?
He's King of England.
King of England. And why? Do you know he's the only king to receive the term great? There's no other king of England that's ever had this appellation given to him. And what made him great was that he founded his kingdom on Christian teaching.
Christian values.
And Christian values. And from that day forth, the English followed the way of the Christians. Yeah? And it turned us from a bunch of barbarians to a civilization that became the envy of the world. But now look at us. Look at how far we as English people have fallen. Our children are growing up in broken homes without mother or father. Our menfolk giving themselves over to drug addictions and to the abuse of alcohol. We entertain ourselves with trinkets and games, whilst our communities are falling apart and our society is being taken over by a liberal establishment.
Look how many single mothers there are, where their children become a ward of the state.
Yeah.
On benefits.
Because English men have failed to care for English women.
That's very true.
Look at what happened in Rotherham to those poor girls. There is plenty of blame to go around. We're quite comfortable blaming the Islamic grooming gangs, and rightly so, because what they did is horrific. We're quite comfortable blaming the police, because the police deliberately ignored the crimes because of a political ideology that does not want to describe the world as it is, but instead wants to describe the world as they want it to look.
I mean, has anyone ever asked the question, these children that come from these broken homes, where's the father?
Exactly.
Where's the love?
You beat me to it. What we need to do as an English community is to look at ourselves and say, why were those children so vulnerable to begin with? Where were their fathers? Shame on all their fathers that had these children and then abandoned them to be raped. Where were those fathers protecting their mothers? This is the problem that atheism has led amongst the English.
Can I just say something? During the war, a lot of children lost their dads in the war.
Absolutely.
They didn't grow up with fathers, right?
But this is a different thing.
You didn't have Islamic paedophiles grooming people, which you have now. This is what's got out of hand. You're always going to get broken homes.
Sister, unfortunately, this argument doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is because we're not talking about after a war. Those children that were raped in Rotherham are alive today. And they allowed their children to be vulnerable. Because, no, they did allow. Because the English, due to abandoning the Christian faith, have lost that concept of personal responsibility, of self-discipline.
How does being a Christian serve anything?
What, sorry?
How does being a Christian serve them?
Well, let me give you an example. We live in a culture that has given itself over to the abuse of alcohol. I'm white working class, so I know this, I've lived it, I've experienced it. So I'm not some middle class toff looking down on the white working classes. I come from a council estate. And I know the amount of abuse of drugs and alcohol that goes off in council estates. Christianity, allow me, yes it does, because the Christian faith when we put God first in our lives, not our own entertainment, then it restricts what we do because of our love for God.
Why does your God let you do that?
Well, allow me to answer your first question, and then I'll deal with your second. So, because we love God, set limits on our lives, because you seek to please those that you love. Like, you know from your own experience, when you love your mother or your brother or your sister, even though sometimes you get it wrong, like we do as Christians, you try to do that which makes them happy. And so it is with God. We love God, and so we try to do that which makes God happy. This is how it changes us. This is how it makes us different. Yeah? Now, in terms of the question about what happened, why did God not intervene to stop these rapes going on? Well, this is the classic question about suffering. God allows suffering in the world because he wants us to be moral beings. And moral beings can only be moral beings if they are able to make free moral choices.
I mean, what these people are trying to say is, why didn't God come down and intervene personally?
Yeah.
But we all know that's not possible. Yeah. What you're trying to put across is that the reason why God didn't intervene because the people never had God in them.
Yes. And what I'm also trying to say
I think he's trying to tell you that you can't have objective morals without God.
I agree.
I don't agree.
Right. We'll come to that. So what I'm also trying to say is that there is a hubris and a pride amongst our community. A hubris and a pride that doesn't want to face up to the fact that we are actually part of our own problem. Our apathy is not by accident. The fact that the vast majority of our own community have no care for what's happening in the political world and just think it's all a load of bollocks, they're all the same politicians, I'm not fucking voting. I come from a working class community. I know the kind of things that we say to ourselves. That kind of rubbish comes from a fact that we are so filled with hubris and pride that we think that we don't have anything to sort out amongst ourselves, and we do.
You could also go back to saying the core of the problem is the education system in this country. That is a core problem.
Yes.
There's no values anymore. It's the education standards in this country are quite poor unless you can afford public.
Moral relativism, which is the philosophy of the liberal establishment, is now being taught in our schools, and we have surrendered our children and their minds to liberal, progressive indoctrination.
I've seen it.
And until we stop cooperating with the state, establish private schools. Yeah? Send your children to Christian schools. Yeah? How are you doing? Send your children to Christian schools. Demand that those Christian schools practice the Christian faith and teach it, and not follow that multicultural rubbish that has so failed our society. And I'm saying that because the church has a model of multiculturalism that works. The liberal multiculturalism doesn't work. If you go to any church, any Sunday, you're more than likely to see a group of people of different ethnicities and tribes worshipping God together. We Christians have practiced multiculturalism for 2,000 years. I don't need to take a lecture on multiculturalism from a liberal.
No.
Because a liberal's multiculturalism failed. Society fails when it follows multiculturalism of the liberal brand.
You're correct. I've seen it. I've worked in schools recently, and I've seen the liberal mantra plastered all over, and these are like primary schools, and I've seen it, and it's quite astonishing.
And they have the minds of your children.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not saying that the liberal state is as bad as the Nazis, but it's not far. Hitler once boasted. He said, "What you think doesn't matter because we have your children." And he was applauded for it. But he was speaking the truth, because he understood that now that the Nazis controlled the state education, that within a generation or two, anyone who was opposed to the Nazis were irrelevant.
Because the children have been indoctrinated with 15 minutes.
Exactly, and the liberals think the same. They think that you do not matter because they have your children in their hands.
Yeah. There's a lot of people I know that they don't really want to have their children taught in state school. If I had children myself, I would definitely question whether I wanted to send them to school. in a state school. I'd rather teach them myself if I could do that, because as I said,
Easy thing to do.
I know
wouldn't
it's
be
not
an
an
easy
easy thing to do, but then I'd rather have
I
a
would
child.
encourage you instead to send them to a Christian school.
Well, I would prefer to teach them myself.
Yeah.
School never really did anything for me. Never taught me much. It taught me to read and write. I mean, all the knowledge and skills I've garnered, I got after school.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not.
I think that the only way that any project against the establishment can work is if it is rooted in a culture that predates the establishment agenda. Because you can't defend England if you separate England from its Christian past. You can't stand up for anything English if you think that being English isn't about being Christian. Because English identity has been interwoven with the Christian church for over 1,000 years now.
What's happening now? If you proclaim to be English and hold up the English flag, in many parts of society, you're a racist. You're a bigot.
When you hold up the English flag, whose flag are you holding up?
Our country. It's the Union Jack.
Hold on, it's the Union Jack.
It's a cross.
It's a cross.
St. George.
You're holding up a cross, and who was St. George?
Of course.
He was an Armenian. So we English proudly fly the cross of an Armenian. That's my point, is that being Christian and the English being Christian actually opens our horizons to the world, because what it does is it links us to a global movement called the church. The English took as their patron saint an Armenian, not an Englishman, and they did it with pride. For England and... No, for England and St. George was the battle cry. That was the battle cry of the English. For England, our nation, and the Armenian saint, who is the patron of our nation. So being a Christian is about being interwoven into a global community called the church. It means that it's not about ethnicity. Being English is something that elevates us out of simple parochial boundaries, but it also solidifies an identity against the globalist agenda that seeks to diminish any culture and turn it all into a giant melting pot, because it proudly says, we as Christians have our own history, we as Christians have our own culture, we as Christians have our own identity, and we're not going to let you take it away from us.
I have a question. So, how do we go about promoting those Christian values? I mean, surely you're not thinking of enforcing them top down.
No, this would be silly. We have to deal with the reality that we're in today.
Right.
We promote them by living them first. That's what we do. Because unless you can convert yourself, how can you convert the nation around you? Unless you can live a noble life, how can you call people to nobility? Unless you can show Christian love, how can you ask people to practice it? Now, I'm not standing here, brother, saying that I'm a saint. I still sin. I still struggle with all the sins that you probably do. Yeah? But what I'm saying is that the energy of my life is orientated to something above and beyond and greater than myself. Which means that what happens to me is not as important as the cause. And if I have to sacrifice myself for the triumph of the church, so be it. And that's what I'm calling you to do. I'm calling you to be a warrior of Christ, a true soldier of the living God.
It's been very interesting.
All right.
It's been a pleasure, mate.
You look after yourself.
I will.
You're going to get that Bible out?
Yeah, I'll download it.
All right. You look after yourself. God bless you and take care. And congratulations on the things that you're changing about your life.
Yeah.
They're good things to
It's
do.
going to be a struggle, but
Yeah.
I've been through worse.
You're going to do well. Godspeed. I'll pray for you. Take care.